Hello and a very warm welcome to the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. And as you can see, we're in a pub, but we're in a different pub this week because we've vacated the Press Bar on Albion Street in Glasgow. We've come all the way along the M8 to the Kilderkin, and we're very grateful to them for hosting us this afternoon. Now, the importance of this particular hostelry is that it's a 30-second walk to the Scottish Parliament, which means it's going to be very easy to get guests here. And I'm delighted to say that our first guest in Edinburgh, in person, is Michael Marra MSP. Thank you very much for your time, Michael.
Thank you. I would have travelled further than 30 seconds, it's fair to say, but it was... Yeah.
Well, that's what a free pint, the offer of a free pint will do.
Get a Dundonian in the room, that's fair enough.
Well, of course, you were elected to Parliament in 2021, list MSP for the North East. You're looking after finance for Scottish Labour, and we will no doubt come back to that as this podcast goes on. But when we get a guest for the first time, we like to sort of do the backstory before you were elected. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and tell us a little bit about the events which, in a sense, anchor your own view of the world and your own politics.
Wow, okay.
So that's quite straightforward.
Yeah, I'll get... So half an hour later, he'll tell me to shut up, I suppose. So, Dundee, born and bred, Labour family. My great-grandfather was a councillor in Dundee. He also founded the Jute and Flax Workers' Union, which was the biggest trade union in the city for many years. Very important union in terms of the kind of transformation of many of the people who are in my family and in my community, so Irish Catholics in the Lochee area of the city. And so I think politics in essence was a little bit in the blood. We probably first went door knocking or leafleting at the age of 8. I think 1987 general election was probably the first one. And so it's always been kind of part of who I've been, who the family is. Not all politicians in the family. My sister was a member of the Scottish Parliament as well. Before me, she stood down after the pandemic election, I suppose. She had another child during the pandemic and decided that she wanted to stand aside, and I won the ballot for North East Scotland. But I think kind of that part of the influences, I suppose, where I'm the son of 2 teachers and who both work in primary schools, or did work in primary schools in Dundee, and very challenging areas. And I think that as much as we had, a good, secure upbringing, their experiences of working with kids from some of the most challenging backgrounds with real problems in their lives was kind of foundational experience in terms of who we were and how our politics evolved, very much about poverty and education.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of people because we're about the same age, Michael, and but a lot of people our age, have that kind of upbringing, that kind of background and so on, have gravitated to the SNP over the last, 25, 30 years and so on. Was that something that you were ever tempted to buy in the slightest?
No. Somebody said to me recently, actually, after, we've obviously the winds at our backs a little bit at the moment, so the recent success of the general election, and a guy in Dundee said to me, "Oh, you've done so well, and you stuck with them when it was hard." And I kind of thought that, it was never an option to be anything other than Labour in that regard. And I know that sounds kind of doctrinaire, and there has been times, of course, over the years where you doubt, where you think, is this going the way that it should be? But it's a bit more visceral and in the soul, I think, in terms of, I'm born a socialist and I expect to die a member of the Labour Party.
Well, a social democrat then.
Yeah, well, I would still call myself a socialist.
You're very, very clear there that you would never, under any circumstances, be attracted by the SNP. But let me get your views on politics in Dundee, because I'm considerably older than both of you. And I remember when Dundee was an absolutely rock-solid Labour constituency. In the past, it was represented by people like George Thompson, who was the last Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs in the Wilson cabinet, also had to deal with the fallout of UDI and Rhodesia in the mid-1960s. Very, very prominent individual. Back in those days, Dundee was a Labour city. And then, of course, in 74, Gordon Wilson makes a breakthrough. Of course, there was a by-election in Dundee in the early 70s, which Labour held on to. But seminal moment in terms of Gordon Wilson, and it then becomes much more of a bare-knuckled fight, and for a long number of years, a sort of feeling that it's a nationalist city now. What went on there? Why did it fall out of love with Labour?
It's a really good question. I mean, you point, I think, so for quite a lot of years, the east of the city was a swing seat between Labour and the SNP. So Gordon Wilson, Jimmy Reid was our candidate at one point. There was trying to
National Executive Committee ignored the constitution of the party to parachute him in.
Yes, indeed. And Jimmy and I talked about that campaign. I knew him quite well towards the end of his life, and we spoke about it quite a lot. And he had his reflections about some of that, the nature of that end of the city in terms of the way that worked. I think this is probably the other part of my upbringing, is that there was, essentially Irish Catholic background, and there was not just that trade union affiliation within it, but over time, the movement of the Catholic vote in Scotland towards the SNP, which very carefully targeted by Alex Salmond, I think is one of the underlying currents of this, in the
Central Belt phenomenon as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and in 2014, we know that the four local authority areas with the highest concentration of Catholics were the only ones that voted yes in the referendum. So, Motherwell, West Dunbartonshire, Dundee, and
Glasgow.
Glasgow. So that concentration was certainly a part of it. And so I think that shift in that community over time, I think, is probably the part of that undercurrent. There was also, and absolutely clear, that there was, many years ago, there was a corruption in the Labour Party in Dundee. So dominant was it. All entirely dominant political parties become corrupted. Power does that. It become unchallenged and untrammelled. That, frankly, in many ways, I think you see that in the SNP now. Really unchallenged power for too long corrupts them in different ways. I don't just mean on a money side. They become unaccountable to people, so they start to do stupid things and irresponsible things. And I think at times in the city's past, and that's certainly baked in a little bit into the kind of the feel of where that's at. But the city has, I believe, in terms of the dominance of the SNP, has suffered over the last 15 years, where we've not been a politically contested space. We've not been able to win the arguments for resource, and that's really affected us badly as a city.
Mm-hmm. And then you have, Dundee is interesting because a lot of people associate it, I think, perhaps people who don't spend a lot of time there, with industrial decline, poverty, a hard luck city in certain respects, and that is obviously one aspect of things. But on the other hand, when you look at things like life sciences, computer games, and so on, Dundee is actually a hub of significant national importance on some of these things. So there are, the story is always more complicated than of decline and poverty. But what's your sort of sense of where Dundee is now and where it could be in 5-10 years?
You tell that story about the life sciences side of Alex, and I think for many people listening to this, they wouldn't think this would be their first reaction, that this would be the case. But for 2 decades now, the University of Dundee has been the top university in the whole of the United Kingdom for life sciences, and the REF, so the Research Excellence Framework, it's like the absolute gold standard. There is no place like it. There's no place that achieves at that level, and that was raised at First Minister's Questions today. The UK Labour Government, £30 million award into one of the research units in the university. But at the same time as they're doing extraordinary work in drug discovery, right in the same city, we have the highest drug deaths in Europe. And there is a real bifurcation there between the absolute excellence, it's down excellence, and incredible leadership by groups of individuals, frankly, that have nurtured these clusters, whether it be the computer game side of it, whether it be the life sciences, and the creative industry more broadly in Dundee. And then that really endemic issues of poverty in the city that has been proven to be incredibly difficult to break. I mean, I think those are probably issues that have dominated my 3.5 years in Parliament so far in terms of the constituency work. The performance of drug and alcohol services in the city, mental health services, so closely attached to it. But partly there's guys I went to school with, friends who I stood on the terraces with at Tannadice, who I've lost, but more particularly lost their families to drugs. I don't think there's any families in Dundee who haven't been touched in some kind of way by that. And of course, all of that is such a close relationship to poverty, and that is a post-industrial effect. We see that across Scotland. But it's also a services not working, and actually in Dundee a particular issue about how those have performed. I could talk a very long length about the way those particular services have failed people.
Mm-hmm. But when you look at Dundee and Glasgow to a large extent as well, and you compare on the subject of drugs, Dundee, Glasgow with, say, Liverpool, Newcastle, other cities that have had, post-industrial decline, the situation is vastly worse when it comes to drug problems and drug deaths in Dundee and Glasgow than it is in those great cities of the English North. Why is that?
It's a really good question. I think it is a deeply inconvenient fact for the Scottish Government that despite what they are calling best efforts, the drug deaths remain up to 4 times higher in Scotland than they do in the rest of the UK under the same drug laws. So this is not about the kind of question about whether things are prohibited. It's not about whether, frankly, the having certain kind of interventions, which might be consumption rooms or drug checking services, because those things haven't happened elsewhere either. The problem is deeper, more endemic. There's a few reasons, I think, for that. There was a very significant spike in drug deaths in Scotland after 2014 when Scottish clinicians decided to stop prescribing Valium to drug users, and it seeded an illicit benzodiazepine market in the whole of Scotland, and the drug deaths spiked almost immediately. So atizolam, gabapentin, kind of different forms of illicit substances that into that drug chain. All drug deaths now are polydrug deaths, so it's heroin with, or it's crack cocaine with, and those issues of that has been a particular driver of the increase since 2014, and that was a policy decision. It was a policy decision that was taken in Scotland. I think it's the most lethal failure in policy since devolution. I have now, just in the last couple of months, managed to identify the meeting where that decision was made. And I've been asking and trying to find out for years now. And part that's not necessarily within it to hold people to account. These clinicians made these decisions because they could see that people were essentially using Valium to try and manage the come down off of heroin highs. And they felt that if they stopped that would put people in a better position. But what they did was just seed this marketplace, which hasn't existed anyplace else at the same level. So that's one of the most recent examples. But clearly the deeper side of that, for the real departure, which is particularly noted since 2014, those issues of poverty, post-industrial poverty, is particularly acute. But I also don't want to be too generic about it because the drug problem differs from city to city. So, and that, to me, in some respects, that's kind of a fascinating thing in a way around the drug problem in Aberdeen is incredibly different to the drug problem in Dundee. I mean, the drug death figures are still much, much higher, but the much bigger problem with cocaine all over times, and that's about the structure of the economy, a ready cash economy, people coming off rigs, and the availability of more money. But the structure of the services over the last 20 years have been abysmal. Absolutely abysmal to actually help people into recovery and to sustain that.
Let's sort of move out of Dundee for a while, but we won't before I simply make the point. I mean, you were very upfront there about being in power for too long and how being in power for too long, particularly if you don't have a good opposition, leads to a sense of decay and corruption, because many people in Dundee didn't talk to STV for many years because we did a documentary in the Dundee Labour Club. And my favourite line from this was one of the Dundee councillors who used to meet a lady for what the tabloids would call trysts, and this was in an empty council house with a blow-up bed. So that was the kind of stuff that we were covering in that documentary. But let's get off this awful tabloidy stuff. I always like to sort of try and get a handle on where people are anchored politically within the party. Now, you referred to parents as teachers, which in a sense is the gold standard in terms of a socialist career, to empower people through education, to give them opportunity and to better their lives. In terms of the Labour spectrum, from the Tribune group to sort of Clause 4 socialism under, because you said you were a socialist, Clause 4 socialism under Corbyn to the kind of sort of social democratic mixed economy model. Where do you stand in that pantheon?
So I've always seen myself probably on the soft left of the party in reality. And I mean, disclosure, Alex and I have known each other for a long time. When I was a Glasgow University student, and I certainly in those younger days was probably more heated and angrier about some things than I am now. I think there's a kind of a maturity, hopefully, that comes with age and politics as well. But I've always seen myself as being, I believe in a radically different economy, a different way, and a more redistributive view of how we should structure things. I think I am angered by poverty, very angered by it. I think that much of it is about the structures of society that place people in conditions that they can't escape because our economy doesn't provide them with the means to do it. I do believe in personal responsibility. I believe in a mixed economy. I believe that side of it. But I am hungry for change.
So if you say you're on the soft left, because of course the term soft left entered the Labour Party when Neil Kinnock wrote an article for Tribune, which was to say why he wasn't voting for Anthony Neil Wedgwood Benn in the deputy leadership contest of 1981. That's when the term soft left came in. And of course, the very individual who led the soft left, Kinnock, then jettisoned everything which the soft left were defined by in those days. And he went to the stage where he went way past folk like Hattersley and Healy on the right. So what does soft left actually mean?
It's a good question, and I think these kind of the labels of this. I mean, I've tried to set out in terms of where I think about economic policy, what I think about social policy. For me, I think there's also a slight departure around some of this in terms of the departure at the point where the Corbynites came in. And actually, I think there was a reorientation of the party, which essentially became, if you excuse me, sane or insane. You know, and those were essentially what it became. And I have probably found over the last kind of 10 years more accommodation and common purpose with more people who I think would be on the traditional kind of you put it the Hattersley kind of right of the party. And I mean, these are people who are in power or not in power, before I was born. But those get that side of it, I think, has shifted significantly. So in many respects, I think those kind of terms of soft left and otherwise are probably quite redundant now. What I am absolutely focused on, and I've always seen as part of it, is that I do believe in the practical deliverability of politics to make change in people's lives. I believe in the power of government to do that, and I think that we need Labour governments to do that. And that's what I'm driven by, to make sure that we get power to deliver for people, and I will work with people to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you talked there about the Corbynite era of the divide in the Labour Party between sane and insane. Those are your words and so on, not mine, although I happen to agree with you there. When you look at the Scottish Labour Party over the last, 15, 17 years, the party loses in 2007. It accepts that Alex Salmond has a right to form a government. It didn't have to do that. The Labour Party could have held on in power, but the direction of travel was clear, I suppose, at that election. And it then took a very, very long time for the Labour Party to, I think, come to terms with that defeat, to start understanding it, and then begin the process of rebuilding. And that's actually really only begun in the last handful of years, I would suggest. One Scottish Labour figure said to me a wee while ago, the difference between Anas Sarwar and some of his predecessors as leader of the Scottish Labour Party is that Anas actually wants to win, which was not the case by this estimation with some of his predecessors. When you look at Labour's performance in the general election, which obviously, a thumping victory in the Scottish portion of the election, and of course in the UK overall, how much of that do you think can be ascribed to Labour's recovery, Labour putting its house in order in Scotland, Labour offering something to the people, and how much of it is a consequence of the SNP's decline? So where do you put that balance? How much of that was a Labour victory and how much of it was an SNP defeat?
Well, the Labour Party of 5 years ago would have performed nothing like the Labour Party of today did. So in that respect, in terms of the transformation that Anas has made of the Scottish Labour Party, has been profound, absolutely profound. And I see that as a member as well as a parliamentarian in the operation of the party, the culture of the party, and the actually, and I think you're right, the hunger to actually take power to serve people properly. And that, I think people feel that, and they can see it. They can see it in an aspect. I hope they can see it in more of us in the years to come. But of course, the strategic positioning around the failure of the SNP and their long and continued decline is certainly part of that picture as well. There's no doubt about that. There is a government that genuinely has lost touch, that is incredibly tired. I mean, Sleepy John, given his programme for government yesterday, was like a good indication of that. They have lost, and I don't think they, in their hearts, want to be in government anymore.
I'm going to suggest to you that the Labour result in Scotland at the general election was more impressive than the party's performance down south.
Oh, statistically, there's no doubt about that.
The statistics actually show that. I'm equally going to suggest to you that I think that the foundations can be fragile, because this has been a long way back for Scottish Labour, and I would characterise the result in Scotland as people are prepared to listen to Labour again, people are prepared to give Labour a chance, and one of the reasons they're prepared to give Labour a chance is that when you go through a checklist of policies on the SNP's watch, particularly in terms of the delivery of public services, people ain't happy. Now, in order to get over the line in 2026, I think it's important that your strategists don't think that it's just a case of keep the show on the road and let's have more finance statements like the ones that we had on Tuesday, and let the SNP ministers make a mess of the implementation of this, because in 2026 you're going to have a distinct offer, which means that people are not only prepared to give Labour a chance, but if I can put it like this, people are prepared to fall back in love with Labour because they see that Labour are on their side on a whole series of areas where there is a material difference between your social democracy and that the SNP would also call social democracy. Now, you have this portfolio, which is going to be absolutely key in fashioning that offer. I don't expect you to write a manifesto, Michael, but
that is part of my job. I actually am charged with writing the manifesto as well.
How far have you got?
It's almost done.
Tell me what your thoughts are on the nature of the offer, where you actually need to concentrate.
So there are clearly big strategic problems in terms of how our public services are structured and are not working at the moment. So I think that across the last decade in particular, but across 17 years, the SNP really have done nothing to adjust to the three big trends in our society. So demographic change, technological change, and climate change. You could maybe say that there's some stuff that they've done around climate and mitigation in different places, but overall, the broader impact of that in terms of our public services has been unaddressed. The demographic change has just been completely neglected, and we've known for decades that this is where we're
Can I just say you're absolutely right, and we have talked about this time and time again in this podcast. You're absolutely right to say that the SNP have done nothing about what were absolutely predictable consequences based upon the demographics. But you know what?
Yeah.
The demographic time bombs were all there 25
Absolutely.
years ago. They were all there when your party was in power first time around. The failure collectively to deal with this is a collective failure of centre-left parties in the devolved era.
I think that's probably reasonably fair. I would say that at the time, Jack was quite cognizant of this. He talked quite a lot about making sure working visas, making sure we can try and actually have post-study visas. That was part of a response to those issues, and he was thinking strategically about some of those longer term issues. But what we now have is we're day to day, we're seeing the impact of all of that on our services, whether it be the NHS and the huge weight of an elderly population on that. And now, I think increasingly worryingly, around the shrinking of the tax base in comparison to the dependency within the population. And that is going to produce very significant long-term pressures. But it's happening now. It's having an impact right now. So the question being, what are you going to do about it? Well, we have to make sure that we focus on some of those key outputs, just as in the early parts of devolution we had to focus on big killers, whether it be cancer, heart disease, stroke, and we made significant progress in dealing with some of those issues in big parts of Scotland. There were some areas of deep poverty where we didn't manage to do it, but addressing some of those underlying health inequalities, but focusing our NHS to deal with some of those big issues where we need to actually put it back in the service of people. Because there's the spend side of this, but there's the tax side of it as well. And people, I think in Scotland, are increasingly angry that they can see that they are paying more but they're getting less as a result. And they know now, many people, they're paying considerably more than people in England and the rest of the United Kingdom. But when the core service, I'll come back to the NHS, that they absolutely rely on, isn't there when their mother has cancer, or when the screening programmes have fallen over, then it's unacceptable to them. The number of people who are having to turn to private healthcare to actually to get the kind of care at all that they require. So making sure we deal with those. Now, those are complex and deep issues. I'm not going to set out a programme towards it, but it's that kind of issue. The education system in Scotland is grossly underperforming for the resource that's put into it. We have to make sure that we can actually drive up standards across the board. I think we've had, if I'm honest, a tendency in the education discourse to allow standards to fall rather than to argue for ever higher and push for higher standards in that. And we're investing significant amounts of money at the moment, and we should be getting more as a result.
But, if you look at, if you were to draw a Venn diagram of 129 MSPs and so on, on questions such as health, education, a whole range of other policy areas and so on, there is going to be a near total overlap between the SNP and Labour. On a lot of these issues, there is not a huge amount of obvious, clear difference between the parties in terms of their approach. So on health, for instance, I am not at all clear what a Labour government in Holyrood would actually do differently. On education, I am even less clear what a Labour government would do. I think back to the years when you had very significant education reforms being pushed through south of the border by Andrew Adonis and Tony Blair and others, and these were far too radical for the Scottish education establishment, far too radical for the SNP, far too radical for the Scottish Labour Party, and I haven't seen much that has changed there. If you think of education on the weaknesses of curriculum for excellence, well, that was something that was endorsed by every political party in Scotland. So I would suggest that perhaps there is one of the problems with Scottish politics is that it's actually on a lot of these issues there is too much consensus.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, Alex. I mean, if consensus was going to be a strength, then it would give us some form of unity of purpose to actually drive forward an agenda of change. But for too often, it's been a cause of stasis. People are frozen around the way that things are done. We're absolutely clear that this. Part of the reason is because of the fiscal situation across not just Scotland but the UK. They're very challenging times, even by 2026. Still likely to be a significant fiscal constraint. What we have to do is look at a significant programme of reform and change in those areas. And it's the right challenge to make, I think. We have got an awful lot to do over the next 18 months to present at the start of a programme about where we would focus those long-term issues. But they are long-term issues because there are parts of the Scottish public services now which are just a Potemkin village, which don't actually exist. In name only, rights to cancer care. In name only, the focus on excellence in different parts of our education system. It's the actual underlying process of that isn't there. So, but I also recognise in that yes, I think we'll do it better. Of course I would. Yes, I think we'll cut out waste. Of course we would. Yes, I think we can get growth back into the economy by a more focused approach and making sure that we can drive growth in different parts of the sectors of the economy. And Anas and Dan Johnson have set out quite a significant amount of work in those areas, the business plan for Scotland and what we might do. But in order to do that, we do need to focus resolutely on making those big changes. And we're going to have to sell that in a convincing way to the public, because I don't just think, as much as this will be, I think, an election, much determined by the record of the SNP, which I think in almost every area is failure, then we do have to have more of, as you put it, Bernard, that general offer where people actually see us as the solution rather than the people who are pointing out the problems. I get it, and we will get there.
Let me say that I think that in addressing the issue of the reform, structures, how things are delivered, who at the end of the day they are there to serve, is an important one, but it is going to take a huge political shift, psychological as well as actual, on the part of Labour ministers to deal with this. Because here's your problem, Michael. You want to invest, but you need to reform. You have to ensure that every single pound of public expenditure is going to the individuals who need it most, whether that be dragging people out of poverty, whether it be giving them educational opportunity, whether it means that they get the health care that they need. When you come up against any reform agenda, you have vested interests, you have professional bodies, you have trade unions, you have people that run organisations. And incidentally, I do not offer any criticism of any professional organisation or any trade union standing up and arguing for self-interest. That is the job of a trade union. Yeah. The job of somebody in government is to look at the bigger picture and to face people down within their own movement, and to say that by having no reform or being too timid in reform, you don't deliver the left-wing values that you have. And if you're a block to reform, if some part of the movement is a block to reform, you're going to have to take them on. And I would come back to the point, there was no evidence that it was going to happen under Donald or Henry or Jack. And I don't think it would have happened, incidentally, under any other Labour leader, because when it comes back to the management of party, you have to square people internally, and there's going to be tension there, and there's going to be a fight, and the issue is, do you actually have the political balls to do it?
Yes, I hope so. But I would say that this is going way back, and I do think the Labour Party is a different place now in many respects, and certainly different people. I'm not sure I agree with the description in terms of some of what happened. The Macron agreement, as well as putting money into teachers' pockets, and I can remember the money going into my parents' pockets at the time. Actually, we went on holiday for the first time in a few years when the Macron agreement started to land.
If I was playing devil's advocate with that, I would have said that what Jack was doing there was buying off the EIS because it didn't have any problem.
But there was working changes as a result of that. So there was two sides to the deal. There was changes to the working structures and what people were doing in schools as a result. So there was a negotiation and a deal that was put on the table. I think what we've had in recent years is that just an acceptance of a direction of travel, that there are, when pay deals or otherwise are put through, we have to actually make sure that there is reform in the public services. And we have to work with the public sector and public sector unions to make some of that happen wherever possible. And then we have to have those conversations about actually the fact that outcomes have to get better. And they do, dramatically better. Because people generally would look at, I think, over the last few weeks, and we've had, the same day that we had the announcement of cuts from the SNP, the GERS figures came out saying that we get £2,417 a head, additional spending in Scotland, extra. And people would look at that and say, well, what the hell are we getting for it? Because they feel that actually the services they rely on, that they have been proud of in the past, are in a process of significant decline, and many of them significantly worse than other parts of the UK.
Let me further suggest that, in Scottish politics over the last 25 years, and this is something that's clearly the case with the SNP, but it predates their arrival in power too. There's been an enormous focus on inputs, on tractor production, and very little focus on outcomes.
Crops yielded.
The question question, do the tractors actually work? And so the standards of, say, education and so on are palpably declining in terms of international comparisons. And when you look at the government's own figures, you have people leaving primary school. Around 25% of primary school kids leave primary school, go off to secondary education without reaching the expected levels in numeracy and literacy. Now that's a tale of relative failure, absolutely. It doesn't tell us about how high the expected levels are, but even within that yardstick, you have there, it would seem to me, a demonstrable case of extraordinary system-wide failure.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, and I think that the outcomes, if you look at maths attainment, at least in many cases a year behind the rest of the UK, and people it begs the question, just what are we doing with our time? And I feel that quite keenly. 25 years of this Parliament, been in for 3.5, and if we can't get those outcomes, if we can't improve our education system, I mean, the game's a bogey. It's like, what's the point of all this? I feel that quite viscerally. I do think that is the core job. And improving those outcomes deals with all the other sides, whether it be poverty, whether it be our public services and getting people into medical school to be the radiographers that we require, all of those side of things. And actually it becomes ever more acute as those demographic pressures come to bear. I mean, it's not just actually the wasted potential of those individuals. It's the single most precious resource we have in the country, which is a diminishing one, which is young people who we are fundamentally failing to give them the opportunity to be a different country together. And that is a sin.
Let's go on to another issue, because I think one of the interesting aspects of the SNP conference last weekend was the acceptance that, and this appears to be in the internal debate, that there was a feeling that they had abandoned aspirational Scotland, and that perhaps the SNP's instincts, in order to sort of get more money, to simply increase tax, whether or not it's fiscal drag, by freezing the allowance for higher earners and so on. There was, I think, an interesting point, which is that clearly they are not going to go in to the Holyrood election in 2026, pledging to increase tax. And we have to remember that the former First Minister, Humza Yousaf, he was toying at one point with the STUC's paper on tax and spend, which would have taken much more money out of actually the pockets, I think, of working people, not of people with broad shoulders, but actually of working people. So given where you want to be, I take it Labour are not, and I'm not asking you to write the manifesto, the instinct at the moment is not to go into 2026 on a tax rising agenda.
Absolutely not. And we've been clear on that, and Anas and I have both said that we will not go into 2026 proposing to increase taxes. And I think because, as I've pointed out already, there's the spending side of this and there is the tax side of it, and people are angry, frankly, about the outcomes they're getting for paying more money. I get that on doorsteps when I speak to people all the time. They don't feel that they're getting back for what they're putting in. I do think that people have been more accepting of paying a bit more. I do think they have.
But they've got to see the benefits of it.
They've got to see what the benefit of that is. And on the very top rate, which has become kind of like a bit totemic in this debate, we're now at the position of there's no more money to be had. The behaviour effects of this, have it was modelled at 80 million down to 8 million I had in my head. I actually think that it'll be a negative outcome. I think the tax change, the behaviour changes in that group will result in that. It will be less than 8 million. I think that putting that tax up will be less. There is basically a very small number of people at that top end. But you point out the fiscal drag issue. That's where actually the bulk of the additional tax money is coming from. And it is people on £40,000 who are far from rich. Particularly given what they've been through over the last couple of years with inflation. They don't feel that they can have the lifestyle that they want to offer to their kids, and that is absolutely right. So no, we're not going to be in that position. I don't think there's much more to come from us there as a country. What we have to do is there's a real focus in my mind about growing the median wage in Scotland, because there's actually a multiplier effect if we manage to do that through the fiscal framework. And if we can combine our economic policy with our fiscal policy, in a smarter way as to where we target and how we target that work, then I think that we can drive much better outcomes for the public purse and to be able to then reinvest in our public services. I think there has been a disconnect. I mean, the stuff this week is just, it's failure writ large. I mean, the conduct of the SNP around the public finances is ludicrous. They have got themselves in a situation where every independent expert, Institute for Fiscal Studies, Fraser Lander, Audit Scotland, the Scottish Fiscal Commission are saying absolutely clearly, this is on you. But yet we've got ministers from the SNP government going on the radio saying it's because Labour have cut our budget. They've not cut anything. There hasn't been a budget. And they're just making this stuff up. But it's to justify their own incompetence. And I think the broader part of that is that they were coming towards the election. They recognised that some changes were probably necessary. They were going to have, but they've just put it off and put it off. So you see all of these kind of spending changes being rolled into future years and saving up what already potentially in 2026, should we have the opportunity to serve, looks like a really difficult inheritance.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask about some of the stuff for 2026. I mean, opinion polls at present, suggest that it would be sort of neck and neck between Labour and the SNP in terms of who would be the largest party. They also suggest that it is quite unlikely that there would be a pro-independence majority in the next Parliament. And it's also, I think, at the moment quite hard to see how you could get the SNP Green band back together, even if you wanted to. So then you are left with the question of parliamentary arithmetic. Alex Cole-Hamilton, during the general election campaign, made it absolutely clear that he would love a job in a government led by Anas Sarwar, and essentially would, spent one of the TV debates sort of pleading for that job. So you've got the Liberals in your pocket, and there won't be that many of them, so you won't need that bigger pocket. But you then need to find some votes from elsewhere. Now, it seems quite unlikely, notwithstanding the commonality on quite a large number of issues, except for the Constitution, between Labour and the SNP, that you could have a Labour-SNP coalition. So you're then most likely looking at a minority coalition with the Liberals that probably relies on Conservative support to pass budgets. Is that how you see it? Or who could you not do a deal with?
Well, given the opinion polls, there's looks like there's going to be some pretty unsavoury characters in Holyrood after 2026. So they whether it be Alba and Reform or otherwise, these people would probably be on the fringes of all of that. Look, we've been, I think, pretty clear about this already, that Anas and I and the rest of the shadow cabinet see a minority Labour government as the most likely of the good outcomes that we could see in 2026. I mean, we are far from that position. It's nowhere like a done deal. That nothing like it. I can't overstress that. That we have to. There's so much work to be done, as we've already explored between now and then. But the arithmetic around that, I think it is probably back into more of a reset around where we were prior to the hegemony of the SNP, where there will be a more smaller parties, and it might be that we'd have to be, I think rightly so, nimbler, a bit more civil, be able to build coalitions around different votes at different times and different policies. And we are thinking strategically about what some of that will look like, not necessarily around the characters of some of the people, because that changes as quick as you would like, but the reality is thinking through what we would have to do to build a coalition around a consensus for reform in different areas, making sure that we could get a Labour programme through. So we are having those thoughts, but it's we're a fair distance away.
Is it? But is your thinking that it's a coalition in the sense of a loose coalition rather than a formal coalition, rather than having to bring Liberal Democrats or to give Alex Cole-Hamilton a job?
It just depends on the maths. I mean, it depends. I mean, the kind of like how strong anybody's hand is in any of these negotiations depends where the numbers go. And so I don't think we're in that kind of, it's how big is our group, how big is their group, how close is it to a majority, all of that kind of stuff is like, I think we've got a sense of where we want to go. We've set a trajectory. We want to have good relationships across the board with all parties, and I do think actually taking the heat out of some of the politics that we've had over the last decade and the division would be overall a positive thing for Scotland if we can try and do something with that kind of some form of unanimity about the need for change, as well as actually as kind of a relatively centrist, centre-left leaning vision. Then we can make progress for the country.
Is it a possible spanner in the works, in the sense that let me go through a checklist. Scottish Labour Party re-energise, tick. Scottish Labour Party has had plenty of time to think about what it will do, and will get its act together in terms of a policy prospectus for the voters, tick. Labour looking beyond the election about a programme of reform, tick. SNP continuing to struggle, arguably with ministers who are not up to the job, tick. And then there's down south, because you cannot hermetically seal what Labour does at Westminster and say it's got nothing to do with us, particularly on the money. Now, Rachel Reeves is perfectly clear, and I think Alex and I both agree in this. The Labour government at Westminster will stand or fall by its ability to deliver growth, because through growth it can then start to deal with some of the underlying economic and public service problems that are there. How critical is it that Labour at Westminster remain credible? Because if there is a run on Starmer's premiership, if there's a sense that he's not Labour, and we're seeing it over the attacks on the fuel allowance, how important is it that they manage to keep the show on the road?
Well, we're a team, and it's a virtue. And we have to make a virtue of it. So so definitely part of that pitch in 2026 is you will have a better team working together across the whole of the UK between Scotland and Westminster than you will have here. And I think the SNP are aware of that, because they are making great play this week of talking up how receptive Labour ministers are being, frankly, to doing their job properly. And I think it's a departure from people who for years in the UK government haven't done their job properly. But they're talking about how good the relationships have been. Speaking to those ministers, they genuinely just think this is how you do the job. You work with the devolved administrations, you try and make social progress and make good decisions. So, but making that a step change in that to a whole level is part of it. Your broader point about the popularity of a UK Labour government with the electorate is a very salient one. That's one we're very conscious of. So we know that the fiscal situation is really tough. We know that we've made some really difficult decisions already, and there are more to come. There's no doubt about that. But if we want to reset the basis of the economy, then that's what's required. I actually think that's what Scottish people want. I genuinely think, and I've heard this from people in the election just passed around the Westminster election, I think it's what they want for Holyrood too. I think they want competence, they want a sensible government that is not the chaotic mess of what they've witnessed, and whether it be police tents in people's gardens and fratricidal kind of internal warfare. They want, there was a time that was the purvey of the Labour Party. It's not anymore. We're a well-led organisation that's focused on the priorities of the working people of Scotland, and we want to serve. And so that is part of that offer as well. And of course, the two things are tied together. We're very conscious of all of that.
Well, I think that's a fine note on which to bring things to a conclusion. And so on, the promise of a sensible, competent government. I mean, I'm not at all sure that the people of Scotland are ready for that.
From our man of the soft left from Dundee.
Well, indeed. Michael, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you to all of you listening too. If you'd like to support the podcast, the best thing to do is to subscribe on whichever podcast platform you favour, or you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you are a business and philanthropically minded and so on, we would love to hear from you if you're interested.
Help the pensioners.
In sponsoring.
Sorry,
the
help
podcast.
the pensioner.
Yeah. Well, help those of us of working age to keep Scotland's ever-growing band of pensioners in something approaching a comfortable retirement. And you can get in touch with us by email at ponsonbymassey@gmail.com, and that's our handle on Twitter too.
And that's it for this edition. From me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.